Hi everybody, my name is Mercedes, and for this module I will be summarizing the Radical Behaviorism for ABA Practitioners Johnston book, where we read chapter 1, and I'll just dive right in. Some things that were really important for me to first get down when reading this book were the definitions, which included free will, which is behavior that is determined by internal factors alone, and that's something that we have the ability to control. And then we have determinism, which is behavior determined by outside factors, and this is a place where we will lose our autonomy over our behavior, our control over our own behavior. And then behavior, which is anything a person says or does. And now to jump into the reading, Johnston starts off with a vignette about a client, Robert, who lives in a group home, who engages in disruptive behaviors whenever it's time for his afternoon activities with his peers. And he chooses to not participate and instead will disrupt them and engage with them in non-functional ways. There are other characters involved in meeting about Robert and these behaviors and what to do about them. We have Zoe, a BCBA, who agrees that Robert should not be forced to participate in the events, but she does wonder why he isn't interested, and she's persistent in the fact that there's a reason why he would rather be disruptive than engage in the activity with them. On the other hand, we have Liz, who is a psychologist, who says that Robert is free to choose to not participate, as Zoe also says, but she says that Robert doesn't need to have a reason for the lack of interest in the activities. And then also involved are a group home manager, and a social worker. And diving into the reading, first we look at the free will aspect versus the determinism aspect. First, we're looking at things from the inside versus outside perspective. It's whether or not we're looking at internal mental events, which is the inside aspect, or are we looking at the external, the environmental influences that will affect how a behavior happens, what behavior happens. And then from there, we can look at the why the behavior happens. The why is not something that we can necessarily determine or analyze with internal inside aspects. Next, he questions if we are even free to choose our behavior. And then he goes on to talk about free will and saying that it is behavior that is determined by internal factors. And then he decides to question, or is our behavior determined, where he talks about whether or not, where he talks about what determinism is, where it's the behavior determined by outside factors, and this is where we no longer have control over our behavior because it states that our behavior is caused by external factors or contingencies that we are raised with that determine how we will behave because of previous reinforcers for certain behaviors. And then generally we come to a crossroads where we can't prove that everything is caused by an internal factor, but we also can't find the time and the scientific effort and manpower to determine all the external factors that will go into every single behavior. And this is where he just points out one more time that it's always the bottom line and importance is to have a factually sound and supported explanation for everything that occurs. After defining all of the definitions we have to define, free will and determinism, he then starts to point out the issues with both of those sides. He breaks it down into the non-physical causation, responsibility, and the choice aspect of both free will and determinism. So when it comes to the issues that he points out, first starting with the non-physical causation, basically he states that it's hard to understand how events of the mind can cause events in the physical universe because they have no physical dimensions, and so we can't apply the same physical laws to them that we can to things that we can see that are physical in nature. And basically saying mental events can't be considered the same and analyzed the same as things that we see, physical events that happen that can be observed by everyone. Next up is responsibility, and the issues that he has with responsibility is that on one hand, we aren't responsible for our actions because of the influence previous contingencies in our upbringing may have on them and our decision-making skills, whereas on the other hand, we're responsible for our behavior and the fact that we have to live with the consequences of our actions. He goes on to say that just because behavior is determined does not mean that we no longer can claim responsibility for our actions. The consequences always must be dealt with. And then at the end, this comes back to the contingencies. The history of consequences for behaving appropriately will always determine how one will behave, which is the deterministic value in responsibility that outside external environmental factors will all have a hand in the behavior that one engages in. Lastly, he talks about the issues in choice, where with determinism, there's conflicts being made with everything that we've been taught in life. It's always easier to say, I made this choice, and it's hard to explain why we made a choice. And the fact that it is obvious that we make decisions on our own does not make it credible in science, and as he states, empirical evidence for the existence of free will. Overall, I felt like the goal of this chapter was to introduce us to the fact that we have to learn a new language. As a student of ABA and wanting to be BCBA or BCABA, we have to start thinking more so with the physical explanations for causes of behavior versus the non-physical aspects that we're very much so used to using. And for example, we should start using sentences that have a why, such as I used Endgame as an example. Everyone I knew loved Endgame, and I didn't want to be left out. Versus, I decided to go see Endgame last night because I felt like it. And then lastly, Johnston closes with the consequences that practitioners find in their work. And the main idea in that section was that practitioners will have to explain that although it looks like behavior does happen by choice and it's internally driven, the environmental factors have to be taken into account and those must be the focus when explaining that behavior. And that always seems to be the roughest part for me working in ABA too, because it's always easy for me to say, oh, he flipped the table because he felt like it. Whereas when using ABC data, we have to look at what exactly happened before the behavior occurred and seeing if that's maybe one or the reason why a behavior occurred. And that's what Zoe herself in the vignette, going back to the vignette, that's what Zoe wants everyone to see. She wants everyone to see the environmental factors that influences Robert's behavior and looking at those behaviors, the behavior choosing to be disruptive versus the actual disruptive behavior. And the disruptive behavior is not something that can be looked at with a deterministic view, but the one of choosing can be. And that is my summary for this chapter 1. Which leads me to my question for you guys, for how are you gonna start changing how you think about your behaviors and and the behaviors of others? And how are you going to start learning and using this new language that we're learning in all of our books? So yeah, thank you guys for watching and listening, and hope you guys have a great rest of your day.